France, Germany and Spain are about to let go of Europe's most ambitious defense industrial program, namely its next generation fighter jets, or FCAS. First of all, I want to stress that my technical background is very small, so if you're very interested in the engineering and technical side behind these fighter jets, then you should look elsewhere. I will focus mostly on the politics, the economics and the history behind these joint development programs. So if you're still here, let's go. Back in 2017, the French President Emmanuel Macron and the then German Chancellor Angela Merkel joined forces to develop the next generation of air combat systems together. In France, this system was called SCAF, but for the purpose of this video, we will use its English name, which is Future Combat Air System, or FCAS. 2 years later, Spain also joined, and the idea was simple: to replace the French Rafales and the German and Spanish Eurofighter jets with a whole new European system of systems. This means a next-generation fighter jet accompanied by remote carrier drones, all linked together through a combat cloud which shares data between the drones, the next-generation fighter jet and ground control. On paper, this program was considered Europe's ticket to stay in the top level of air powers well into the 2040s and 2050s. Right now, the program has three main competitors. The first one being the American Boeing F-47, named after the 47th president.
It's a beautiful number. F-47.
Then we have the Chinese J-36. This one is actually the most developed and has already been spotted test flying multiple times. But perhaps more interesting for Europeans is the GCAP fighter, which is the fighter jet that will be developed by Japan, the UK and Italy. GCAP started at the height of the Brexit negotiations. However, now it could turn out to be a fallback for Germany if FCAS breaks down. Now let's have a look at why this might happen. The program has been plagued from the start by industrial infighting between its two main contractors, being France's Dassault and the cross-European Airbus defense. These two companies simply can't agree on who gets to do what and who is in the driver's seat. This clash has slowed down development significantly, to a point where right now it is at an actual standstill, and the program's engineers haven't even started on making a flying prototype. When we compare this to the US and the Chinese programs, it increasingly looks like FCAS is stuck at the beginning of the runway. Initially, it looked like everybody would play to their strengths. Dassault would be the prime contractor for the manned new generation fighter jet, and Airbus would lead the drones and the combat cloud. However, this changed when Spain joined the deal in 2019. Spain chose Indra as the country lead for the program. However, Indra is mostly an electronics company, and for the actual work on the fighter jet and the airframe, it isn't especially well placed. Therefore, Airbus Spain will do the bulk of the work on the fighter jet for Spain. And this is where, definitely in the eyes of Dassault, the problems started, because Dassault argues that this has effectively doubled the weight of Airbus when it comes to day-to-day meetings, and that therefore Dassault is no longer the real architect when it comes to the fighter jet. This is something which Spain categorically denies. They say that building modern airplanes is simply more about electronics and system integrations than it is about building an airframe. This brings us to the second part of the problem, the intellectual property. Dassault is extremely protective of what it calls its crown jewels. With this, it means, among other things, its proprietary software and its know-how when it comes to stealth engineering. Dassault argues that it has built up the experience and know-how on these matters over decades on projects like the Rafale and the Mirage, and that it can't simply open up these technologies to one of its main competitors, being Airbus Defense. Dassault therefore wants to work with a clearly hierarchical setup with certain black boxes where the other companies do not get full access to the underlying technologies. Airbus, on the other hand, wants to work with fully integrated multinational teams with engineers from all companies, just like it did on the Eurofighter. Let's stick with this Eurofighter for a moment because it's actually quite relevant to FCAS. In 1985, France withdrew from the Eurofighter program to start the Rafale, and it did so on the advice of Dassault, with the then 92-year-old Marcel Dassault writing a personal letter to French President François Mitterrand. In this letter, Marcel Dassault made a few valid points, one of which is the inefficiency of multinational development programs, which we're also talking about right now when it comes to FCAS. And it is true that the Eurofighter is still a bit more expensive than the Rafale, and this could be partially due to those inefficiencies. However, they are of course two completely different fighter jets, and in the end, Marcel Dassault walked away with a government contract that was about 3 times the size of its initial stake in the Eurofighter. And I think it's fair to say that this was probably his main motivation for objecting against France's participation in the Eurofighter program. Now, let's get back to FCAS. The German defense minister Boris Pistorius has stated that while FCAS remains Germany's first option, if the program keeps on lagging behind the way it has done so far, Germany will have to start considering other options. On the French side, Dassault's CEO, Éric Trappier, has answered the German remarks with his own escalation.
Je veux bien que les Allemands grondent. Ici, on sait faire. S'ils veulent faire tout seul, qu'ils fassent tout seul.
This is not the language of quiet compromise. It's actually more of a rallying call towards French public opinion against FCAS. However, this frame glosses over some very awkward details. First of all, Airbus is actually just as French as it is German, and the French state actually owns a larger stake in Airbus than it does in Dassault, which is still primarily owned by the Dassault family. Secondly, it is not up to the leader of a privately owned company to decide over taxpayers' money. If France decides to develop the next generation fighter jet all by itself, with Dassault as its prime contractor, then Dassault will be the main beneficiary of that decision, with French taxpayers footing the bill. And it's fair to say that French public finances are not in a great state to begin with. Let's zoom out from the Dassault-Airbus conflict and focus on the future. Right now, there are 3 possible paths. The first one is the grand bargain scenario, where Paris, Berlin and Madrid work things out. There are actually a few ways in which they could do so. One way, which is often cited, is that they let go of the equal pay, equal workload method they are using right now. In this case, that would mean France would pay more into the program in exchange for a larger share of the workload for Dassault. In that case, the other partners, Spain and Germany, would also have less problems for France and Dassault to install their own methods, such as black boxes to conserve their IPs, etc. The second scenario is the soft split, where the fighter jet itself is delinked. France makes their own follow-up to the Rafale, Germany and Spain make their own follow-up to the Eurofighter or join the GCAP program, but certain elements of the FCAS program, such as the combat cloud, are kept in order to maintain a certain level of interoperability between whatever jets these countries produce. Third scenario is the complete collapse of FCAS, where not even elements like the combat cloud are maintained. Right now, the soft split scenario seems the most likely. This would be a way for the involved politicians to save face, and it would also not be completely detrimental to European interoperability. However, this could mean that Europe might end up with 3 to 4 different fighter jets, being France's follow-up to the Rafale, whatever fighter jet Germany and Spain decide to make, the GCAP fighter, and even SAP in Sweden is also thinking about a next generation fighter jet. This scenario is very reminiscent to the mid-80s, when Europe decided to develop 3 different fighter jet programs, being the Rafale, the Eurofighter and the SAP Gripen. But this ignores one very simple thing. When it comes to building these fighter jets, certainly within the small European context, the most important element is scale. Scale actually impacts pricing far more than the inefficiencies of multinational development programs. Let's have a look at the total production numbers of these 3 fighter jets. All of these programs are around 40 years old. Now let's have a look at the 20 years younger F-35. Even if we take away the US's domestic orders, then the gap still remains immense. And remember, the F-35 only had half of the time to achieve all of these sales. The reason why so many countries have bought into the F-35 is actually quite simple. Lockheed offers a 20 years younger jet with far greater capabilities at a lower price. Now, there are some side notes to this. The F-35 is still a bit more expensive to fly, and of course all of these platforms have had massive updates since their conception. But still, this is like putting a new GPS in an old car. It gives you extra capabilities, but it doesn't turn your old car into a new one. And the fact that the F-35 is half the age of the other fighter jets and is cheaper to buy simply makes it irresistible for other European nations. But how about the recent orders of India buying Rafales and Turkey buying Eurofighters? Actually, one of the main reasons why India and Turkey have bought these European jets is because the US simply didn't want to sell them F-35s. And this is in part because these countries operate Russian aircraft defense systems. And it's quite obvious why the US does not want to see its F-35 fighter jets in the same ecosystems as Russian aircraft defense sensors, because that might train them to the F-35's flight patterns or certain weaknesses. So how can a company like Lockheed achieve such competitive prices? When the US started with the development of the F-35, it immediately ordered over 2,000 fighter jets. And that allows a company like Lockheed to set up massive production facilities, to buy massive amounts of resources. For Europe's fighter jets, these program targets were 5 to 10 times lower. Now later on more orders followed, but you can see how it is difficult to set up large-scale, highly efficient production units when your orders are coming in at about 10 units per year versus when you get one large order of over 2,000 fighter jets. And the effects of scale advantages don't just end there. You also have, for example, the cost of your R&D. The total R&D cost has to be spread out over the total production, meaning that if you're only producing a handful of fighter jets, either your jets become far more expensive or you start cutting corners. And it is exactly this variable which Europe is now about to destroy again for its 6th generation fighter jet. And Europe won't just divide its internal market between these 4 fighter jets, because once again the F-47 will likely be cheaper and have greater capabilities, resulting in many European countries once again choosing that option. Or if the rift between Europe and the US keeps growing the way it is right now, certain European countries might even start looking at Chinese alternatives. And this would be a massive shame, because Europe has all the ingredients to create the world's most capable fighter jet, and only when it works together then can it achieve the scale necessary to compete with the US. And we don't even have to look far for an example of this, just look at the world of civil aviation. With Airbus being a collection of national European companies merged together as one and being able to outcompete the US for the last 7 years. Mergers and acquisitions are one possible way for Europe to consolidate its military aviation industry. And in that regard, it is interesting that via the integration of Aerospatiale, Airbus actually already owned 46% of Dassault. Now, because this large share didn't result in any decision-making powers and the Dassault family still held full control over the company, Airbus quickly decided to sell off most of its shares. However, mergers and acquisitions are definitely not the only way forward, because while Europe is competing itself to death on the field of multi-role fighter jets, there are a ton of other aerial capabilities which Europe either is developing right now or which it might develop in the future. So it's not like there isn't any space for European military aviation companies. They simply shouldn't all be focused on the same thing. If Europe is serious about achieving strategic autonomy from the US, then these common development programs will become the norm, and therefore it is crucial to make them as efficient as possible. The European Union already has a few initiatives in place in order to do just that. Now, I have an entire video in which I talk about this, which I will link here. Ultimately, however, it will be up to national leaders to choose a consolidated European defense industry over domestic protectionism, because in the end, that domestic protectionism actually leads to nowhere. Thank you for watching my third video. If you are interested in the subject of European strategic autonomy, then please subscribe to this channel. These videos do kind of take a long time to make, and every subscription I get brings me a dopamine shot straight to my brain. So then I have nothing less to say but goodbye and see you next time.